Hi everyone, welcome back to another COVID-19 update with Dr. Manfred Green, Director of University of Haifa's International Master's Program in Public Health and Global Health Leadership, hosted of course by the American Society of the University of Haifa. Dr. Green, welcome back.
Thanks, James. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. So We're going to start today with the vaccine results coming out of Israel, which continues to serve as a real-life inoculation test for the rest of the world. Over the weekend, Israel's health ministry said that the latest data showed the vaccines were 98.9% effective at preventing death caused by COVID-19, which really is some statistic. Some other figures include that the vaccine is 99.2% protective against serious illness and decreases the chance of hospitalization by 98.9%. How impressed are you by these results? And what does that mean for our efforts to find a way beyond the global pandemic?
Right. First of all, I think that we are, as you can imagine, very pleased with the results. They are very close to what was seen in the clinical trials, sometimes maybe a little better if we're looking at overall effects like deaths and hospitalizations, because we're now in a much bigger sample. It's not really a sample almost, it's virtually a population. So it's working very well. And what is also impressive is that they are now showing declines in mortality and in cases, particularly in the over 60, 70, 80, those that were vaccinated early on. There's going to be a lag period, just so people remember that when you vaccinate, you basically are vaccinating someone today who may have been infected in the last week or 10 days and still doesn't have symptoms. And then those people are not going to be included basically because the vaccine won't work on them. And then of course, it's going to take time to get infected and then get hospitalized and die. So you need to take probably the point of vaccination, maybe take 3 to 4 weeks to really see an impact. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And in fact, I'm sure that's what we're seeing now. We actually are seeing that decline.
Excellent. So I guess as a result of the vaccine success, Israel began a major easing of lockdown rules. As of yesterday, shops, malls, markets, museums, and libraries open to all Israelis. And the new Green Pass system will allow those who have been vaccinated or those who have recovered from COVID-19 further freedom. What are your thoughts on the country's reopening and of its timing?
First of all, I think it's very good that they're reopening because the stress of keeping everything under lockdown, as everybody knows, all over the place, is not good for anyone. And people are, can't make a living, kids can't go to school and all the rest of it, which is very stressful for the society. So this is a good sign, but I think that what we need to remember is that the epidemic or the pandemic or the outbreak, the spread of the disease can happen at any time. We still don't have a very large percentage of the population immune. We have a considerable number. If we're talking about 500,000 half the population of half the adult population who've received 1 dose, and a lot of them, very high proportion have received 2 doses. So we're getting to a good point. We're getting to a good place. I think the main message is that those who haven't been vaccinated should get vaccinated. And I know that people have commented, I was at a meeting yesterday, and again, people are asking questions, how sure are you that the vaccine is effective and how sure it is that it's actually safe? And basically, we base it not only on the studies that we have from this vaccine, but on our experience with vaccines. I think people need to remember that every vaccine is introduced after clinical trials, and then there's a period of time where we actually get more knowledge about the vaccine. That happens with every vaccine. The thing to remember is that it's not released for general use until we are really very sure that it's safe.
That's right. So, I mean, on that point, how big a problem still is vaccine hesitancy? Is it more prevalent in certain communities? And how can we overcome that?
Well, basically, I think that we need to have a discussion with people who are either afraid or not enthusiastic about taking the vaccine, and to try to understand why. I must emphasize that any evidence of any kind of safety issue is evaluated very carefully. So we're not assuming that everything's fine. We actually are watching very carefully, the Ministry of Health, any side effects, particularly the more serious ones or those or events that occurred close to the vaccination are carefully evaluated. And although we haven't found anything that's of anything major right now, that doesn't mean you lower your guard. So we keep doing that. So I think, again, that if you compare the vaccine with the disease, and I mean, that's basically what you're doing, there's no doubt that the vaccine is, has a huge advantage. The disease, even in milder cases, we now have evidence can persist quite some time afterwards. And the serious cases obviously are very problematic. So, this is an opportunity both to protect yourself and also to get to a stage where we can open up much more. Because if we can reduce the spread, we're then protecting other people who are sensitive to the vaccine or may have had even vaccine failure, because we recognize that the vaccine is not 100% effective. And so there'll be some people who were fully vaccinated and still became ill. That's a possibility, but it's a small percentage. And I think we need to protect all of us.
Right. Right. Now, away from Israel, we've seen around the world, specifically in South Africa, how variants can potentially render the current generation of vaccines ineffective. What lessons can we take from South Africa, and what does that mean for vaccine manufacturers?
Well, it obviously creates more work for all of those that are involved in monitoring the outbreak or the pandemic, and who are monitoring the vaccine and the virus. It's a virus that does change. I mean, we know that, as it does for many viruses, and particularly what we call the RNA viruses, which are more problematic because they change as they replicate, they mutate and they make changes in their genetic makeup. So basically what's happening is that we are following these, and there are some that have genetically changed sufficiently, at least a part of it, sufficiently maybe to not be recognized by the antibodies that are produced by the vaccine. At the moment, the vaccines that we're using, certainly the Pfizer in Israel, recognizes pretty well the British strain and the South African one and probably others. But we need to follow this very carefully. And it isn't I would guess that in the future, we may well have to probably give an additional dose, and we have to decide when to boost the immune system, to boost the antibody. And also we may have to give an updated vaccine. And the interesting thing is that the technology for vaccines now is so good that the updating can be done very quickly. It's not like the influenza one usually takes months because it's grown on eggs and so on, but now we're not using that kind of technology. The mRNA is particularly a very useful technology in that sense. Pfizer, Moderna, and others.
Right. So, I mean, that's an interesting point right there, because, there have been reports about the AstraZeneca vaccine not being as effective in responding to the South African strand variant. So, is that a process that is already happening with AstraZeneca, trying to modify that vaccine? And, what sort of timeline, because of course there are a lot of people that have already taken that first AstraZeneca vaccine around the world, specifically I think in the UK, where a high number of the population that have been vaccinated so far has been with that vaccine. How long does that process take for AstraZeneca to then modify that vaccine to then have that second shot be effective for the South African strain?
Well, the AstraZeneca is effective, very effective against the British strain, which is the most common one now, and possibly other strains. It has had some problems with the South African strain, as we know, and in fact, South Africa has decided not to use it there. But in the meantime, it's very effective where the strains are common, so British strains and others, so it's still very effective. And if we can reduce the circulation of the virus, we'll reduce also the development of these variant strains, these mutations. So in fact, the AstraZeneca is still very useful as a vaccine outside of South Africa. Even in South Africa, it probably would have given some protection, but probably not enough if you can get a vaccine that gives more. But outside, it still seems to be working very well. So I think we've got to work very hard on just getting people vaccinated and reduce the circulation of the virus. And so this will, in fact, prevent the development of newer strains. And that's something that we have to work on very hard. But the companies are all working on the possibility of updating. I mean, this is a continuous process. And it's basically just identifying the genetic makeup of the new strains and then getting ready to produce the next vaccine.
But as you said, you expect that to not be such a long process, and you know, perhaps AstraZeneca is already working on that modification currently.
Sure, it's much quicker now. I mean, as I say, with flu, as you remember, when we deal with flu strains, it is usually been taking 3, 4, 5 months to get the new vaccine developed after identifying a new strain, because you basically have to grow the virus. It's a process that's grown, basically an egg-based process, although there are other processes. And then the production process takes much longer and so on. Now with this messenger RNA, it's weeks, basically, they can be ready for production. And then they've got production facilities set up. So this is something that's being spoken about, by the way, which is very interesting. And that is to set up many more production facilities, even in, or not only even, but also in developing countries. So it may certainly be, we'll be seeing, I think, production facilities in South Africa and so on, and other countries, where they can very quickly get the vaccine, the new vaccine, and then start the production. And that obviously creates a situation where you will have actually quantities of vaccine much quicker. And I think that's going to be what's going to happen in the future.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Green. I'm afraid we're out of time.
Okay.
Any of you out there do have any questions that we weren't able to address today, please do leave them in the comments section of this video or send them into info@asuh.org, and we'll be happy to address them at a later date. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on our next briefing.
Thanks very much, Dan.